They said it was impossible to build. Engineers quit, mountains crumbled, and the state of Colorado almost gave up entirely on the most ambitious highway project in American history. This is a video to listen to while driving, working, cleaning, walking, or getting things done. It's made for people who enjoy learning and listening, not for those expecting a highly edited or fast-paced documentary. Just relax, listen, and enjoy the story. The year was 1956, when President Dwight Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act into law. This wasn't just any piece of legislation. This was the birth certificate of the interstate highway system, a network of roads that would connect every major city in America. The goal was simple on paper: build roads that let you drive from coast to coast without stopping at a single traffic light, roads that could move military equipment quickly in case of war, roads that would tie the country together like never before. Every state got excited about this. New highways meant new business, new tourism, new money flowing in. But for Colorado, this dream came with a nightmare attached, because right in the middle of the state, standing between the eastern plains and the western valleys, were the Rocky Mountains. Not just any mountains either. These were some of the tallest, most rugged, most unforgiving peaks in North America. And somehow, some way, Colorado needed to run an interstate highway right through them. This is the story of Interstate 70, or I-70 as most people call it. And it's not just a story about building a road. It's a story about human ambition colliding with nature's raw power. It's about money, politics, environmental battles, and engineering problems that seemed impossible to solve. It's about workers who risked their lives every single day in conditions that would make most people quit on the spot. And it's about how one highway project pushed an entire state to its breaking point and beyond. Before we dive into the chaos of construction, let's understand what made this project so terrifying from the start. The interstate highway system was designed with specific standards. Every interstate had to meet certain requirements. The lanes had to be a certain width. The curves couldn't be too sharp. The grades, meaning how steep the road could climb, had strict limits. These standards made sense on flat ground or rolling hills, but in the Rocky Mountains, these standards seemed designed by someone who had never seen a mountain in their life. Colorado's section of I-70 needed to connect Denver on the eastern side of the Rockies with the western part of the state. The most direct route would take the highway through the heart of the mountains, climbing to elevations that would make it one of the highest interstate highways in the entire country. We're talking about a road that would need to reach heights above 11,000 feet. To put that in perspective, that's more than 2 miles above sea level. That's higher than most people ever go in their entire lives, unless they're specifically trying to climb a mountain. The engineers who first looked at this project did what engineers do. They got out their maps, they did their surveys, and they started calculating. And the more they calculated, the more they realized this wasn't just difficult. This was borderline insane. The route would need to cross the Continental Divide, the imaginary line running along the peak of the Rockies that separates water flowing to the Atlantic Ocean from water flowing to the Pacific. This wasn't some gentle hill. This was the spine of North America. Early plans tried to find easier routes. Maybe they could go around the mountains? But going around would add hundreds of miles and defeat the whole purpose of an interstate. Maybe they could follow existing roads through the mountains? Colorado already had some mountain passes with roads on them. These were narrow, winding, dangerous roads that closed down in winter. But they existed. The problem was that none of these existing routes met interstate standards. They were too steep, too curvy, too narrow, and too deadly. The most famous of these old mountain passes was Loveland Pass. This route climbed to almost 12,000 feet. The views were incredible, but the road was a white-knuckle experience. Cars overheated on the climb up. Brakes failed on the way down. In winter, it became a skating rink with 1,000-foot drops on the side. Trucks often couldn't make it through at all. And yet, this terrifying route was actually one of the better options for crossing the Continental Divide in this part of Colorado. Engineers looked at Loveland Pass and had to make a choice. They could try to improve this existing route, widening it and reducing the grade to meet interstate standards. But that would mean an interstate highway reaching almost 12,000 feet, with massive exposure to snow, ice, and brutal weather. Or they could do something that seemed even crazier. They could tunnel through the mountain. Tunneling wasn't a new idea. Trains had been going through mountain tunnels for decades. Mining companies dug tunnels all the time. But this would be different. This would be a tunnel big enough for an interstate highway, with multiple lanes of traffic, ventilation systems, lighting, and safety features, and it would need to be long, really long. The first proposals talked about a tunnel that would be more than a mile through solid rock, at an elevation where the air was thin and working conditions would be brutal. The state of Colorado looked at these two options and did what governments do when facing impossible choices. They formed committees, they held meetings, they commissioned studies, and while they were deciding, the rest of the interstate highway system was being built. Roads were going up in other states, the network was spreading. But in Colorado, I-70 stopped at the foot of the mountains, like a runner who reached a wall too high to climb. This delay caused its own problems. Towns in Colorado that were promised interstate access waited and waited. Businesses that had planned for tourist traffic saw nothing. The ski industry in Colorado was starting to boom in the 1950s and 60s. People wanted to drive from Denver to the ski resorts in the mountains, but the roads were inadequate. Traffic jams on weekends became legendary. It could take 6 or 7 hours to drive what should have been a 2-hour trip. The state was losing money, tourists were getting frustrated, and the pressure to do something, anything, kept building. Finally, in the early 1960s, Colorado made its decision. They would do both. They would build a new highway over Loveland Pass that met interstate standards as much as possible, knowing it would still be steep and dangerous. And at the same time, they would start planning and building a tunnel underneath the Continental Divide. The tunnel would take years to complete, but once finished, it would be the main route, and Loveland Pass would be a backup for when the tunnel needed maintenance. This decision made everyone happy for about 5 minutes. Then the real problems started to show up. Problem number 1 was simply getting to the work sites. Before you can build a highway through the mountains, you need to get workers, equipment, and materials to the places where construction will happen. In flat terrain, this is easy. You just drive there. But the proposed route for I-70 went through areas that were barely accessible at all. Some sections had no roads leading to them. Workers would need to hike in, or equipment would need to be airlifted by helicopter. The first crews that went into these remote areas in the early 1960s found themselves in what can only be described as wilderness. These weren't parks with nice trails and visitor centers. These were steep valleys, rushing rivers, loose rock faces, and forests so thick you could barely walk through them. And somewhere in this chaos, they needed to build a highway. Problem number 2 was the weather. The Rocky Mountains have some of the most extreme and unpredictable weather in North America. Summer thunderstorms roll in with almost no warning, bringing lightning that strikes the peaks constantly. Workers on exposed ridges were literally in danger of being struck by lightning on a regular basis. Rain turns the ground into mud and causes rock slides. And then there's winter. Winter in the high Rockies is not like winter in most places. It's not just cold and snowy. It's violently, dangerously, mind-numbingly extreme. Temperatures drop to 20 or 30 below zero. Winds scream across the peaks at speeds that can knock a person off their feet. Snow doesn't fall gently. It comes in blizzards that dump several feet in a single night. Avalanches roar down mountainsides without warning, sweeping away everything in their path. And this wasn't just a risk in the dead of winter. Snow could fall in July at these elevations. Workers could wake up to perfect weather and be in a life-threatening storm by lunchtime. In most construction projects, you can just stop work when the weather turns bad. But that option doesn't exist when you're trying to finish a project that's already years behind schedule and millions over budget. So work continued in conditions that seemed insane. There are stories of workers at the tunnel site dealing with temperatures so cold that diesel fuel would gel up and become useless. Equipment broke down constantly. Metal became brittle in the cold and would snap. Hydraulic fluid thickened and stopped flowing. Starting an engine in the morning became an hour-long process. Problem number 3 was the rock itself. When you're tunneling through a mountain, you're dealing with rock that formed millions of years ago under intense heat and pressure. Sometimes that rock is solid granite, hard but predictable. But often, especially in the Rockies, you're dealing with layers of different types of rock, some hard, some soft, some cracked and fractured, some full of water. You never really know what you're going to hit until you hit it. The crews working on what would become the Eisenhower Tunnel faced all of these issues and more. They started drilling in 1968, beginning from both sides of the mountain at the same time. The plan was to meet in the middle. This is standard practice in tunnel building, but it requires incredibly precise surveying. If your calculations are off by even a little bit, the two halves of the tunnel won't line up, and you've just wasted millions of dollars drilling 2 useless holes in a mountain. The actual drilling process was brutal. They used a method called drill and blast. Basically, you drill a bunch of holes into the rock face, pack them with explosives, evacuate everyone from the area, and set off the blast. The explosion shatters the rock, and then you haul out all the broken rock, drill new holes, and do it again. Over and over and over. Each blast might advance the tunnel a few feet. The tunnel needed to be more than a mile long. You can do the math on how many times they had to repeat this process. Every blast was dangerous. Sometimes the rock fractured in unexpected ways, and huge slabs would fall. Sometimes the explosives didn't go off properly, and someone had to go back in and deal with live explosives embedded in rock. The air inside the tunnel was thick with dust and fumes from the explosives. Even with ventilation systems pumping air in, the conditions were harsh. Workers wore masks, but those early masks weren't like the high-tech filters we have today. You were basically breathing rock dust and chemical fumes for hours at a time. And then there was the water. Oh, the water was a nightmare. As the tunnel crews drilled deeper into the mountain, they kept hitting underground water sources. Water would come pouring out of the rock face, sometimes in small trickles, sometimes in massive floods. This water was ice cold, just a few degrees above freezing. It would flood the tunnel floor, making everything slippery and freezing. Pumps ran constantly to remove the water, but they couldn't keep up. Workers were often standing in several inches of icy water while they worked. The cold water created another problem. The tunnel was already cold because it was inside a mountain at high elevation, but the water made it worse. The tunnel temperature hovered just above freezing. Workers wore multiple layers of clothing, but when you're working that hard physically, you sweat, and then the sweat freezes. People were constantly dealing with the balance between working hard enough to stay warm, but not so hard that they'd sweat themselves into hypothermia. Injuries were common. In the first few years of tunnel construction, there were dozens of serious injuries. Broken bones from falling rock, burns from handling explosives, lung problems from breathing bad air, frostbite from the cold, and then there were the deaths. The first death on the project happened in 1970 when a worker was crushed by a piece of heavy equipment. Over the years of construction, several more workers would die in the tunnel. Each death led to investigations and safety reviews, but the fundamental reality didn't change. This was dangerous work in a dangerous place, and people were going to get hurt. The families of these workers lived with constant anxiety. Many of the workers were local Colorado men, but some came from all over the country, attracted by the high wages. The pay was good because it had to be. Nobody would do this work for normal construction wages. But even high pay doesn't make it easy for a wife and kids to watch their husband and father go into a tunnel every day, knowing he might not come back out. While the tunnel crews were dealing with their underground nightmare, other crews were working on the above-ground sections of the highway. This came with its own set of problems. The route of I-70 through the mountains required cutting into hillsides, building up embankments, and creating a relatively level path through terrain that was anything but level. This meant moving massive amounts of rock and dirt. When you're building a highway through mountains, you end up with what engineers call cut and fill. In some places, you're cutting into the side of a mountain, removing material. In other places, you're filling in valleys and low spots with that material. The goal is to balance it out so you're not hauling material long distances. But in the Rockies, this process created slopes and cuts that were massive. Some of the cuts into mountainsides were hundreds of feet tall, creating artificial cliffs alongside the highway. These cuts caused their own problems. When you slice into the side of a mountain, you're exposing rock that's been locked in place for millions of years. Sometimes that rock is stable and stays where you want it, but often, especially in the Rockies where you have layers of different rock types, the rock starts to move. Gravity takes over, and you get rock slides. Small ones would drop rocks onto the construction area. Large ones could bury equipment and threaten lives. Engineers tried to stabilize these slopes using various methods. They would drill long bolts into the rock to hold it together. They would spray concrete onto loose rock faces to keep everything in place. They would install mesh and netting to catch falling rocks. But despite all these efforts, rock slides remained a constant threat during construction and would continue to be a problem long after the highway opened. The environmental impact of all this construction was enormous. The route of I-70 went through pristine wilderness areas. Rivers and streams had to be rerouted or bridged. Forests were cleared. Wildlife habitats were destroyed. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the environmental movement was gaining strength in America. People were starting to question whether we should be building highways through wilderness areas at all. Environmental groups began to protest the I-70 project. They filed lawsuits trying to stop construction. They pointed out that the highway was fragmenting wildlife habitats, making it difficult for animals like elk and deer to migrate. They worried about water pollution from construction affecting mountain streams. They argued that the visual impact of a massive highway cutting through pristine mountain landscapes was destroying something precious that could never be replaced. The state of Colorado found itself caught between competing pressures. On one side, you had businesses, ski resorts, and local governments demanding that the highway be finished. On the other side, you had environmentalists and preservation groups demanding that it be stopped. And in the middle, you had a construction project that was already underway, already over budget, and already causing problems. One of the major environmental battles centered around the route through Glenwood Canyon. This canyon on the western side of the mountains is one of the most beautiful natural features in Colorado. Steep walls rise thousands of feet above the Colorado River, which flows through the bottom of the canyon. The old highway through the canyon was narrow and dangerous, carved into the canyon wall. The new interstate would need to be much bigger, but building it would require blasting away parts of the canyon wall and potentially damaging this natural wonder. The fight over Glenwood Canyon went on for years. Environmental groups proposed alternative routes that would bypass the canyon entirely, even though these alternatives would cost more and take longer. The state argued that going through the canyon was the only practical option. Eventually, a compromise was reached. The highway through Glenwood Canyon would be built, but it would be designed to minimize environmental impact. This meant more expensive construction methods, including extensive use of bridges and viaducts, to keep the highway from taking up too much of the canyon floor. It also meant aesthetic considerations, like using colored concrete that matched the canyon walls and designing retaining walls that looked more natural. This compromise satisfied almost nobody completely, but it allowed construction to continue. However, it also set a precedent. This wouldn't be just any interstate highway. It would be a showcase of how modern highway construction could work with nature instead of just bulldozing through it. That sounded great in theory, but in practice it meant even more complexity and even higher costs for a project that was already pushing the limits of what was possible. Back at the tunnel site, the crews drilling from both sides of the mountain were making slow progress. By the early 1970s, they were well into the mountain, but they weren't even halfway done. The rock they were encountering kept getting more difficult. They hit sections of fractured rock that required extra support to prevent collapses. They hit more water, requiring more pumping. And they hit sections where the rock was so hard that it dulled their drill bits almost immediately, requiring constant replacement. The cost of the tunnel was spiraling out of control. Early estimates had put the tunnel cost at around $40 million. By the mid-1970s, it was clear the final cost would be well over $100 million. In today's money, that's more than $500 million for a single tunnel. For Colorado in the 1970s, this was an almost unimaginable amount of money. The state kept having to go back to the federal government asking for more funding. Each time, there were questions about whether to just abandon the tunnel and stick with the route over Loveland Pass. But by this point, abandoning the tunnel wasn't really an option. Too much money had been spent, too much political capital had been invested, and besides, the tunnel was actually working, slowly but surely. By 1973, the two halves of the tunnel were getting close to each other. The surveyors were checking and rechecking their calculations. If the two sides didn't line up, it would be a disaster of historic proportions. In March of 1973, the moment of truth arrived. The crews were close enough that they could hear each other's blasting through the remaining rock. Then they broke through. The two halves of the tunnel connected, and incredibly, they lined up almost perfectly. The two tunnels met with only a few inches of deviation, which was well within acceptable margins. It was a triumph of engineering and surveying, especially considering the difficult conditions and the length of the tunnel. But the breakthrough didn't mean the tunnel was done, not even close. Breaking through meant you had a hole through the mountain, but that hole wasn't yet a usable highway tunnel. The interior still needed massive amounts of work. The floor needed to be paved. Drainage systems needed to be installed to handle all that water that kept seeping in. Ventilation systems needed to be set up. The tunnel would be at high elevation, where car engines don't run as efficiently because of the thin air. This means more exhaust, and in a tunnel, exhaust buildup can be deadly. Massive fans would need to be installed to push fresh air through the tunnel and remove the exhaust. Lighting was another major challenge. The tunnel was over a mile long. Inside, it would be completely dark without artificial light. But you can't just string up some light bulbs and call it good. The lighting needed to be bright enough for safety, but not so bright that it was blinding. It needed to be positioned correctly, so there weren't dark spots or confusing shadows. And it needed to be reliable, because if the lights failed when the tunnel was full of traffic, you'd have instant chaos. Safety systems were a huge concern. The tunnel needed emergency exits in case of fire or accident. It needed fire suppression systems. It needed communication systems, so that tunnel operators could talk to drivers if needed. Remember, this was the 1970s, before cell phones. If your car broke down in the middle of the tunnel, you needed some way to call for help. Emergency call boxes were installed at regular intervals along the tunnel walls. All of this additional work took more time and more money. The tunnel finally opened to traffic in March of 1973. Wait. Let me correct that. The breakthrough was in '73, but the tunnel didn't actually open to traffic until March of 1979. That's 6 more years of work after the breakthrough, and it shows just how much effort goes into finishing a project like this. When the tunnel finally opened, it was a big deal. They named it the Eisenhower Tunnel, after President Eisenhower, whose Highway Act had started this whole thing. It was the highest vehicular tunnel in the United States and one of the highest in the world. It was also one of the longest mountain tunnels in North America. The opening ceremony was attended by politicians and dignitaries who gave speeches about American ingenuity and determination. News crews filmed cars driving through the tunnel for the first time. It was portrayed as a great achievement, which it was. But the cost, both in money and human suffering, was rarely mentioned in these celebrations. For drivers, the tunnel was a game changer. What had been a white-knuckle drive over Loveland Pass with hairpin turns and steep grades and dangerous weather was now a relatively easy drive through a tunnel. The tunnel stayed at a consistent elevation of about 11,000 feet, which is still high, but you weren't climbing up and down like on the pass. The grade was gentle. The lanes were wide. It was everything an interstate highway was supposed to be, and it worked. But here's something interesting that happened after the tunnel opened. Traffic through the tunnel exceeded all expectations. Way exceeded them. The engineers had predicted a certain amount of traffic based on population and existing travel patterns. But the reality was that once the tunnel made mountain travel easy, way more people wanted to do it. The ski industry in Colorado exploded. Resorts that had been small local operations became major destinations. Towns on the western side of the mountains, which had been fairly isolated, suddenly had easy access to the Denver metro area. This increased traffic created its own problems. By the early 1980s, barely a few years after the tunnel opened, it was already getting congested. Weekend traffic, especially during ski season, would back up for miles waiting to get through the tunnel. The tunnel had 2 lanes, one in each direction, and that wasn't enough. Adding lanes wasn't an option. You can't just widen a tunnel that's already been built. Well, you can, but it requires basically building a new tunnel, and that's exactly what Colorado decided to do. In 1985, they started construction on a second tunnel right next to the first one. This second tunnel would be dedicated to westbound traffic, while the original tunnel would handle eastbound traffic. The second tunnel, eventually named the Johnson Tunnel, took another 6 years to build. It opened in 1991. So now you had 2 separate tunnels side by side, each handling traffic in one direction. The construction of the second tunnel was, in some ways, easier than the first. They now had experience. They knew what kind of rock they'd be dealing with. They had better equipment and better techniques. But in other ways, it was just as hard. They were still drilling through a mountain at 11,000 feet. They still had water flooding in. They still had dangerous conditions. And they still had workers getting hurt and occasionally killed. While all this tunnel work was happening, the rest of I-70 through the mountains was being completed in sections. The route from Denver up into the mountains was finished relatively early, in the late 1970s. This section had its own challenges, with steep grades and curves that pushed the limits of interstate standards. But it was nothing compared to the tunnel section. The section through Glenwood Canyon, which had been so controversial, wasn't started until the 1980s and wasn't finished until the early 1990s. This was the last section of I-70 in Colorado to be completed, and by the time it was done, it had become one of the most expensive rural highway sections ever built in America. The cost per mile was astronomical, running into tens of millions of dollars per mile, but the result was actually pretty impressive. The highway through Glenwood Canyon doesn't look like a typical interstate. It curves gracefully along the canyon walls, crossing back and forth over the Colorado River on elegant bridges. The bridges themselves became minor architectural landmarks, designed to be beautiful as well as functional. Retaining walls were textured and colored to blend with the natural rock. Trees and vegetation were carefully replanted after construction. Instead of destroying the canyon, the highway became part of it in a way that, while not perfect, was better than anyone expected. The completion of Glenwood Canyon in 1992 marked the official completion of I-70 through Colorado. The project had taken more than 30 years from initial planning to final completion. It had cost billions of dollars. It had consumed countless hours of labor. It had cost lives, and it had changed Colorado forever. Let's talk about those changes, because they're complicated. On one hand, I-70 did exactly what it was supposed to do. It connected the state. It made travel across the mountains easy and reliable. It brought economic development to the western part of the state. The ski industry, which is now a multi-billion-dollar part of Colorado's economy, probably wouldn't exist in its current form without I-70. Small mountain towns became prosperous resort communities. People who wanted to live in the mountains but work in Denver could now make that commute. On the other hand, the highway changed the character of the mountains in ways that some people mourn. The wilderness that the highway cuts through is no longer really wilderness. The presence of the highway and the traffic it brings affects wildlife. Elk and deer herds have to navigate around or across the highway, leading to accidents and disrupting migration patterns. The Colorado Department of Transportation has spent millions building wildlife crossings, basically bridges and underpasses just for animals, to try to mitigate this problem. The highway also changed the nature of mountain communities. Towns that were once quiet and isolated are now easily accessible, which brought growth and development and all the complications that come with that. Housing prices shot up. The character of small mountain towns changed as they became bedroom communities for Denver. Some people saw this as progress and prosperity. Others saw it as the loss of something valuable. And then there are the ongoing costs and challenges of maintaining a highway through the Rockies. This isn't a highway you can build and then forget about. The conditions that made construction difficult also make maintenance difficult. Rock slides are a constant problem. The Colorado Department of Transportation has crews that do nothing but monitor rock faces along I-70 and clear debris. Despite these efforts, rock slides still close sections of the highway multiple times a year. Snow and ice are massive challenges. Colorado spends millions every winter keeping I-70 open. Snowplows run constantly during storms. The state maintains a fleet of heavy equipment just for I-70. They use thousands of tons of road salt and sand. They employ avalanche control teams that use explosives to trigger avalanches deliberately when no one is on the road, rather than letting them happen randomly and potentially hitting cars. Even with all these efforts, the highway still closes sometimes. When a major storm hits, I-70 can be shut down for hours or even days. This creates chaos. Thousands of vehicles get stuck. People who thought they'd make a quick trip over the mountains end up stranded. Small mountain towns suddenly have to deal with thousands of unexpected visitors who need food, gas, and sometimes shelter. The tunnels themselves require constant maintenance. The rock around the tunnels is constantly shifting slightly. Water keeps seeping in. The salt used on the roads in winter corrodes everything it touches. Every few years, the tunnels need to be closed for extended periods for major maintenance work, and traffic has to be rerouted over Loveland Pass, which is kept maintained for exactly this reason. There have been some scary incidents in the tunnels over the years. Truck fires are a particular concern. When a large truck catches fire in a tunnel, it's one of the most dangerous situations imaginable. The heat builds up quickly. The smoke has nowhere to go except toward other vehicles. There have been several significant tunnel fires over the years, and while the safety systems have generally worked and prevented mass casualties, each incident highlights the inherent risks of pushing this much traffic through a hole in a mountain. One of the most serious was in 2006 when a truck carrying petroleum products crashed in the tunnel. The resulting fire burned for hours. The tunnel had to be closed for months for repairs. The heat from the fire actually damaged the rock around the tunnel, requiring extensive work to stabilize and repair. The entire episode cost millions of dollars and disrupted travel for a huge number of people. These incidents led to even more safety upgrades, better fire suppression systems, improved ventilation, more sophisticated monitoring systems that can detect fires or accidents quickly. All of this costs money, and it's money that Colorado has to keep spending year after year, forever. The highway isn't just a one-time cost, it's an ongoing commitment. There have been proposals over the years to further expand I-70 through the mountains. Traffic continues to grow. Weekend backups, especially during ski season, can stretch for miles and last for hours. Some proposals have suggested adding more lanes to certain sections, though this would be incredibly expensive and environmentally controversial. Other proposals have focused on better managing the traffic that's already there, like enforcing stricter rules about trucks using the highway during peak times. One creative solution that's been implemented is the use of reversible lanes on certain sections. During peak traffic times heading into the mountains on Friday afternoons or coming back toward Denver on Sunday afternoons, traffic is heavily directional. Everyone is going the same way, so some sections of I-70 have been set up so that lanes can be reversed, dedicating more lanes to the heavy traffic direction. This helps, but it's not a complete solution. There's also been discussion about whether Colorado needs to develop alternative routes over the mountains. Maybe another highway somewhere else, but every feasible route faces the same challenges that I-70 faced. You're trying to build a modern highway through extremely difficult terrain. The cost would be enormous, the environmental impact would be significant, and honestly, it's not clear there's enough demand to justify it. For better or worse, I-70 is the main route across this part of the Rockies, and it's going to stay that way. Looking back at the entire saga of I-70 through the Rockies, it's hard not to be impressed by what was accomplished. Engineers and workers achieved something that many people thought was impossible. They built a highway that crosses the Continental Divide, reaches elevations above 11,000 feet, and operates reliably year-round. They created tunnels that are marvels of engineering. They constructed a route through Glenwood Canyon that manages to be both functional and relatively sensitive to the natural environment. But it's also hard not to wonder about the cost. Was it worth it? That's a question that probably doesn't have a single answer. If you're a ski resort owner or a resident of western Colorado who depends on easy access to the Front Range, then yes, absolutely it was worth it. If you're someone who values wilderness and thinks we've paved over too much of the natural world, then maybe not. If you're a taxpayer looking at the billions of dollars spent and the ongoing maintenance costs, you might have mixed feelings. The workers who built the highway certainly paid a price. The men who died in tunnel collapses or equipment accidents paid the ultimate price. The workers who suffered injuries, lung damage from breathing bad air, or long-term health effects paid a price. Even the workers who came through physically unscathed often talk about the psychological toll of working in such dangerous conditions for years at a time. There are stories from the tunnel workers that didn't make it into official histories, but get passed down anyway. Stories about near misses where someone should have died but didn't. Stories about feeling the mountain itself, fighting back against the intrusion of the tunnel. Stories about the strange quiet that would settle over the tunnel sometimes. A quiet so complete it felt oppressive. These stories capture something about the experience that dry engineering reports miss. The project also revealed something about American culture in the latter half of the 20th century. We were a country that believed we could and should overcome any obstacle. Mountains in the way. We'll tunnel through them. Environmental concerns. We'll address them with engineering. Cost overruns. We'll find more money. The attitude was that nothing was impossible if you threw enough resources at it. This attitude built I-70, but it also led to some of the problems. Maybe more careful planning and less determination to push forward no matter what could have resulted in a better outcome. Or maybe not. Maybe sometimes you just have to commit to something difficult and see it through. One interesting aspect of the I-70 story is how it affected the engineering profession. The challenges of building the highway pushed engineers to develop new techniques and solutions. The tunnel construction led to advances in tunneling technology. The environmental concerns led to new approaches in highway design. Young engineers who worked on I-70 took those lessons to other projects around the country and around the world. In that sense, the project contributed to knowledge and expertise that went far beyond Colorado. The highway also became part of Colorado's identity. If you live in Colorado or even if you just visit regularly, I-70 is part of your life. You have stories about traffic jams on I-70. You have stories about that one time you drove through the tunnel in a snowstorm. You know exactly how long it takes to get from Denver to various mountain towns. The highway shaped how Coloradans think about their state and how they move through it. For tourists, I-70 is often their first real experience of the Rocky Mountains. Driving west from Denver, the mountains gradually appear on the horizon. Then you're entering the foothills, and the road starts to climb. Then you're in the mountains proper, with steep peaks on all sides. Then you're entering the tunnel, and for a minute, you're inside the mountain itself. Then you pop out on the other side, and you're in a different world. The western slope of the Rockies has a different climate, different vegetation, a different feel. The tunnel literally takes you from one world to another. That experience, which millions of people have had, wouldn't exist without this highway. There's something almost mythical about the Eisenhower Tunnel. It's a portal through a mountain. It's a modern marvel that also feels slightly impossible. When you're driving through it, especially for the first time, there's this awareness that you're inside a mountain. There's millions of tons of rock above your head. The tunnel walls are close. The light is artificial. And then after a mile or so, you emerge back into daylight. It's a strange experience, and it's become one of the iconic parts of Driving through Colorado, the tunnel has also become a place of its own weird culture. Truck drivers have their own stories and superstitions about the tunnel. There are unwritten rules about how to drive through safely. Don't change lanes in the tunnel. Keep your headlights on. Keep a safe distance from other vehicles. These rules exist because the tunnel is, in some ways, more dangerous than normal highway driving. If there's an accident in the tunnel, there's no shoulder to pull onto, nowhere to go. So drivers who use it regularly treat it with respect. Maintenance workers who work inside the tunnel when it's closed to traffic describe it as an eerie place. The silence when no cars are running through is profound. The air is cold and damp. The walls show the marks of the drilling and blasting that created the tunnel. You can see the layers of different rock types. You can see where water seeps through constantly, despite all the waterproofing. It's a reminder that the tunnel isn't really a permanent structure. It's a temporary intrusion into the mountain, and the mountain is constantly trying to reclaim it. This gets at something important about I-70 through the Rockies. It's not a permanent solution, it's a temporary one. The highway requires constant work to keep it functional. The tunnels need constant maintenance. The slopes need constant monitoring. The winter snow needs constant clearing. The moment Colorado stops putting effort and money into maintaining I-70, nature will start taking it back. Rock will fall. Snow will accumulate. Water will seep in. Within a few years, without maintenance, sections would become impassable. Within a few decades, nature would reclaim most of it. This impermanence is true of all highways to some extent, but it's especially true of I-70 through the Rockies. This highway exists in an environment that's fundamentally hostile to its existence. It's there because humans have decided it's worth the constant effort to keep it there. That's both impressive and humbling. There have been moments over the years when it seemed like the effort might not be worth it. After particularly bad winters, or particularly expensive repairs, or particularly serious accidents, there are always some voices asking whether Colorado should just give up on maintaining I-70 year-round. Maybe close it in winter? Maybe restrict it to certain types of vehicles? These discussions never go anywhere because the economic and social cost of closing the highway would be too high. But the fact that these discussions happen at all shows that keeping this highway open is never a given. It's always a choice. In recent years, climate change has added another layer of complexity to managing I-70. Weather patterns in the Rockies are changing. Some years have less snow, which you'd think would make maintenance easier, but less snowpack means more drought and more rock slides. Other years have more intense storms, which dump huge amounts of snow in short periods, overwhelming the ability to keep the highway clear. The variability makes planning difficult. There's also the question of what happens as Colorado continues to grow. The Denver metro area is one of the fastest growing in the country. More people means more traffic on I-70. At some point, the highway may simply not have enough capacity, even with all the improvements and management strategies. What happens then? Nobody has a great answer to that question. Some proposals have focused on alternatives to driving. What if there was a train connecting Denver to the mountain communities? High-speed rail. This gets proposed every few years, and every few years it's studied and deemed too expensive. The same mountain terrain that made building a highway difficult would make building a train even more difficult and expensive. Plus, American culture is heavily car-dependent, especially in the West. People want the freedom to drive where they want, when they want. A train, even a good one, wouldn't fully replace that. So, for the foreseeable future, I-70 is what Colorado has, and Coloradans will have to make it work. This means continued investment in maintenance and safety. It means dealing with traffic and congestion. It means accepting that some weekends the highway will be a parking lot, and there's not much to be done about it. It means living with the environmental trade-offs and the cost and the occasional closures and the ongoing risk. But here's the thing. Despite all the problems and all the costs and all the complaints about traffic, I-70 is used and valued by millions of people. On any given day, thousands of vehicles traverse the highway. They're not all tourists heading to ski resorts. Many are people just living their lives. Commuters, truck drivers hauling goods across the state, families visiting relatives, people moving from one place to another. I-70 serves all of them, and for all its problems, the highway does work. It's safe, relatively speaking. The accident rate on I-70 is actually lower than on many urban interstates, despite the challenging conditions. This is partly because of good design and maintenance, and partly because drivers are more cautious when they're driving through mountains. The highway is also reliable. Yes, it closes sometimes in winter, but considering the extreme conditions it faces, it's actually remarkable how often it stays open. The story of I-70 through the Rockies is in many ways a story about human stubbornness. It's about a group of people who decided they wanted a highway through the mountains and refused to let little things like impossible engineering challenges or massive costs or extreme danger stop them. That stubbornness can be admirable or foolish, depending on your perspective. Maybe it's both. It's also a story about the relationship between humans and nature. Nature didn't want a highway through the Rockies. The mountains resisted every step of the way. They still resist today. Every rock slide, every winter storm, every tunnel fire is nature's reminder that this highway is here on sufferance. And yet, the highway persists. Humans keep maintaining it, keep improving it, keep using it. It's a kind of ongoing negotiation between human will and natural force, and neither side has completely won. The people who drive I-70 today mostly don't think about any of this. They don't think about the workers who died building the tunnel they're driving through. They don't think about the decades of planning and construction. They don't think about the constant maintenance that keeps the highway functional. They just drive, enjoying the views, maybe complaining about the traffic, planning their ski trip or their visit to a mountain town. And honestly, that's fine. That's what the highway was built for. It was built to be used, to be part of normal life, to make travel across the mountains easy enough that you don't have to think about it. The fact that you can drive from Denver to the western slope without thinking too much about what an incredible achievement that represents is, in a way, the ultimate success of the project. But every now and then, it's worth stopping and thinking about it. When you're driving through the Eisenhower Tunnel, take a moment to consider where you are. You're inside a mountain. You're driving through a hole that humans carved with explosives and determination. Above you is more than 1,000 feet of solid rock. Below you, the road surface covers the drainage systems and infrastructure that keep water from flooding the tunnel. Around you, ventilation systems are pushing fresh air and pulling out exhaust. Lighting systems are making it possible to see. Safety systems are monitoring for problems. All of this exists because decades ago, a group of people decided it should exist. They faced problems that seemed impossible, and they solved them. They dealt with conditions that would make most people quit, and they kept going. They spent money that seemed astronomical, and they found more money. They lost friends and colleagues to accidents, and they kept working. They built something that will serve people for generations, as long as we keep choosing to maintain it. The highway that nearly broke Colorado didn't break Colorado. Colorado bent, adapted, and ultimately succeeded. The scars of that success are visible in the form of the highway itself, cutting through the landscape. The costs of that success are counted in dollars and lives and environmental impact. The benefits of that success are enjoyed by everyone who drives the highway and everyone who depends on the economic connections it created. Was it worth it? You'll have to decide that for yourself. But either way, it's one hell of a story. It's a story of ambition and achievement, of struggle and sacrifice, of engineering and determination. It's a story about what humans can accomplish when they set their minds to something, for better or worse. It's a story that's still being written every day, with every vehicle that drives through those tunnels and every maintenance crew that works to keep the highway functional. I-70 through the Rockies stands as a testament to what was possible in the mid to late 20th century, when America was building big and thinking big. Whether we would or should undertake such a project today is an open question. Environmental concerns would be greater. Costs would be even more astronomical. The political will might not exist. But back then, it happened. And now we live with the results, using a highway that connects the state, serves the economy, and reminds us that humans are capable of remarkable things, even if those things come at a cost. If you found this story interesting, go ahead and subscribe for more long-form stories.